When I was in my 20s, one of my buddies had left town for the weekend. He was a single guy who lived alone in a tiny house that backed up to some woods and needed somebody to watch Baxter, a little black kitten he had just adopted. For 2 months prior, my buddy had been working at a local farm, and Baxter was a part of the litter that one of the barn cats had given birth to. He was the runt, and his mother often ignored him on top of his siblings, pushing him out of the way when it came to nurse. So, he was left neglected, malnourished, and partially starving. My buddy, who's always been an animal lover and too sympathetic for his own good, decided to take Baxter home and nurse him back to health. This worked, however. Baxter had caught an infection which would require him to take medicine 3 times a day. This would otherwise be fine if my friend didn't have a family emergency that required him to skip town for a bit. On top of that, the medicine had to be dispensed a few hours before or after Baxter ate. So my buddy asked me to house it and take care of Baxter in exchange for some money. I was also single, disconnected from my family, and struggling with unemployment, so I had no financial support system in place. I definitely needed the extra cash. So I agreed, despite the short notice, of course. He gave me a piece of paper indicating when to feed Baxter and when to give him his medicine. He also told me not to let Baxter outside, that he had a tendency of trying to escape. It seemed easy enough, and as my buddy had cable, I could just keep myself entertained while staying at his house for the day. The first few hours of the house were pretty uneventful. The most exciting thing was the task of trying to get Baxter to take his meds. It was in liquid form that came in a syringe, and I had to dispense it in his mouth. If you've ever owned a pet, you'd know how much of a pain in the butt they can be when it comes to that kind of stuff. Still, I managed to make it work, and I fed him 3 times a day that my friend asked me to. Most of the time, I just watched TV, while Baxter slept on my lap. I'm not too much of an animal person myself, but given the backstory I'd heard about him, I figured I should let him have the attention that he was deprived of back at the farm. After giving Baxter his last dose of medicine, right around 9 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I'd be back in the morning, so it wasn't like he was going to be left alone for a super long time. I opened the door to leave when I felt Baxter's fur brush up against my legs as he sprinted out the door, and given he had dark fur, I wasn't able to see where he'd run off at first. I didn't have a flashlight or anything of the likes, so I followed him to the best of my ability into the woods. There, I had lost sight of him completely. I walked around, putting my hands around my mouth as I called for him. I didn't even know if he knew his name yet. I heard some hissing and low meows come from the distance, the noises only getting louder and louder as they went on. I jogged towards them, stopping to find 2 pairs of glowing eyes staring at me. The first were clearly from Baxter. They appeared to be high up in a tree branch and were pretty small. The other, though, while still high up, were much bigger. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust in order to make out the figure that belonged to them, and at first, my brain couldn't make sense of what it was. I'd never seen an animal like that in my life. As funny as it sounds, even though it was anything but hilarious in that moment, its body resembled that of a wrestler, or even a bodybuilder. Its spine had a nearly C-shaped curvature to it, and its arms stretched high above its head, as its gigantic claws gripped the tree that Baxter was in. Its head didn't match its human-like figure at all. It was simply that of a dog's. The monster had quickly lost interest in Baxter and directed its attention now towards me. Going back down on all fours, and though there wasn't much light, I was able to make out the deep scratches it had made in the tree that it had taken hold of. I didn't even have the time to scream, and found myself running for my life before I even knew it. I had gotten back to the house, locking the door behind me and pushing a nearby shelf in front of it. I then went to the back door, panicking, which was already locked, and also blocked it with furniture nearby. I paced around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I peeked out a window, but there was nothing in sight, and I wondered if the thing even bothered to chase me in the first place. Did I just dream this whole thing? Was I sleeping and this was a nightmare? I knew Baxter was probably dead by now, or at least he would be soon, and I knew my buddy was going to kill me if that was the case. Somehow, I didn't think he would believe me if I told him that there was some sort of hellish-looking creature lurking in the woods behind his house. He'd been living there for 3 years and never spoke anything about the sort. Although I appeared to be safe, I didn't feel comfortable even going outside to leave in my car. So I spent the night in the house. I somehow managed to fall asleep. When I awoke the next morning, I pondered on whether I should try and look for Baxter. He was probably dead, and the creature from the night before was still in there. But at the same time, I didn't know how my buddy would react to such an event, like losing Baxter. I ultimately decided I'd look for him, but only got so many yards into the woods before giving up and turning back. I wasn't going to put myself in unnecessary danger for just a cat. I moved the furniture back and went to search for Baxter. I called out for him, and to my pleasant surprise, I heard him meowing. I followed the meows, and he was still up in the tree that I had found him in last night. I was more easily able to see the scratch marks in the bark now, and they were even longer and deeper than I'd ever remembered. They seemed to be more closely resembling gashes, and a shiver went down my spine just upon the sight of it. I then noticed paw prints on the ground, most of them leading back into the deeper section of woods. As quietly as I could not to attract any attention from the beast, I encouraged Baxter to come back down from the tree. It took a couple of minutes, but eventually he complied, and I carried him back to the house, pacing my walk as fast as I could. I fed him and thought about what to do next. Ultimately, I ended up packing up his food and medicine and brought him back to my apartment. My landlord did not allow animals, so I had to be careful when it came to getting him in. I gave him some newspaper to use as a litter box, but the damn thing pissed on the floor anyway. I just kept him in the bathroom for most of the time after that, and fed him, and gave him his medicine at the time that it said the previous day. Once it was time for my buddy to come back home, I took Baxter back to the house, and instead of leaving, decided to wait for my friend. Once he entered the house, he seemed surprised to see I'd stuck around, but wasn't unwelcoming or anything. I gave him a few minutes to wind down and settle in, before letting him know the events that unfolded just a couple of days prior. He was mostly just confused, and asked if I was sure that it wasn't just a wild dog. I told him I was certain. He shrugged, and said he was glad that I got Baxter back, and then gave me my cash. I figured it wasn't my problem anymore, and just went home. Well, a little under a year later, Baxter went missing again. He'd snuck out of the house at night when the back door was left ajar. It didn't shock me, to say the least. He was born on a farm after all, and the outdoors were his calling, even if the outdoors had all sorts of predators lurking in the woods, some more terrifying than others. A few days passed, and Baxter never came home. I helped my buddy put up missing cat posters, but deep in my heart, I already knew what had happened. My buddy was in denial, and he would spend a lot of time in his woods searching for his cat. It wasn't until he himself saw the same hunched-over figure of the canine-like creature Lurking in between the trees in the distance, did he realize I wasn't lying. I just wanted to tell him I told you so. But he was grieving with the loss of a pet on top of all the other crap going on in his life. He sold the house eventually and moved in with me, which was helpful, because even though since I'd gotten a job, it was just barely enough money to keep my head above the water. My landlord also amended the rules and began allowing pets, with a fee, of course. It wasn't long before another cat made its way into our apartment. My place wasn't anywhere near the woods, but my friend and I were both extremely careful to make sure our new cat didn't get anywhere outside the apartment. I still wasn't much of an animal person, and I still am not. But with that dog creature's gigantic claws that were practically kitchen knives and teeth I could only presume were equally as heinous, I can only imagine the fate that must have met Baxter. I couldn't allow another creature to experience a gruesome death again. I didn't know whether I was too big a prey for the thing to hunt upon. I would be surprised if I was, given that thing had to be a good 9 or 10 feet tall. But I found myself feeling grateful that I managed to escape. My luck ended there, though. For years, I had nightmares filled with vivid depictions of becoming a victim to this thing. I'd have dreams where my innards were ripped out, and my neck was crushed within its jaws. The worst part, though, was that my buddy also had nightmares, except I was still the one being killed in them. He said that he could only stand there and watch. I'm not particularly religious or anything, but I do sometimes wonder if something watching over me spared me of that fate. Or maybe I just simply slipped through the cracks, and Baxter was the second best thing.